Definitely, it's self-awareness is important, and I think a sense of, I think people are sort of, I don't mean humble in a pathetic way, but they're, relatively muted about their own skills rather than saying, well, I've got an automatic God-given right to something just because I've done something else. Marcus, when you're looking at AIM companies as maybe listing or maybe as challenging, how do the sort of the people on top, the people looking standing on one side, but not necessarily the shareholders, but maybe the FCA, the exchange, how are they looking at the makeup of boards and what do they think of how it should be?
So there are a number of answers to that, and there are a number of factors. And one of the interesting things about AIM is that we don't specifically have a corporate governance code. We rely very heavily on the UK governance code and a number of investor codes that exist. But actually there are lots of other factors that are just important. So if we see a company where, say, the chairman is the founder, and has got a combined role as a chief exec and has a big chunk of the stock, and the rest of the board is composed of people who are linked to him or friends at school or in the same business, then that tells me as much about the likely governance and the likely structure of that business than reams and reams of disclosure. And I think the world has moved on very significantly over 20 years since AIM was formed, and I think originally there probably was a kind of core set of non-executive directors in particular that ended up having quite long lists of non-executive directorships across the quoted and listed community. I think not only the responsibilities but the expectations of directors has changed very significantly, and I think particularly since the financial crisis, investors expect to be able to have access to across the board, and they expect non-executive directors to have a good knowledge of the business and to be able to pick up the phone and get candid insights. And so I think one of the things that has changed is that there is an understanding, particularly with quoted businesses, that one of the benefits of being a quoted business is that they tend to have a higher profile and credibility than private businesses. But then, the flip side of that is that when things aren't going quite as well, that is also very much in the public domain. And so, one of the things that I hear a lot from people who have either been in the quoted sector or have got a number of directorships is not to have too many, because there can be times when actually being a non-exec in a quoted or a listed business suddenly takes up a lot of time. And so I think that's one of the other things that we look at when companies are coming to market and on an ongoing basis, to make sure that there's the right fit of skills, the right checks and balances, the right knowledge base, but also people don't have reams and reams and lists of directorships. And it's all of those things that I think you start looking at businesses and you can quite quickly actually form a view of whether the board is being put together to kind of look good on paper, and actually there is the right mix of skills that will mean that there's the right level of challenge within the board.
Thank you. Ian, I know that you were mainly on this particular panel because you're trustee in the charitable stuff, but how much, and I'm just to lose it, how much work is one of these high-level non-exec positions? Is it? I mean, I hear stories if it's FTSE 100, it's 3 days a week, but it's and how should you think about the value of that time in terms of doing these sorts of things?
Every organisation is different, and I think when you approach a trusteeship, you've got to manage expectations both ways. You've got to suggest what availability you've got and what the expectations are based on you. I would say the average trusteeship is probably about a day a month when you aggregate the time together. That doesn't necessarily mean a day in a physical meeting in an office somewhere. But you know, I've worked with organisations, quite small ones, where they've actually required quite a lot of the individual, so you might be the chair doing 4 days a month. I've worked with big ones where actually the expectations are the same. So it's very hard to answer that, it really does vary. I think just some things to think about if you're thinking about the trusteeship. Is it small, local, national, international? Are you looking for a really big organisation because that lends itself to your background? That's good in one sense because the governance structures will probably be in place. There'll probably be quite a good executive team. Things will be well organised, but actually it can be quite frustrating because you're in a board meeting on a Wednesday and the decision that you've made gets enacted 6 months down the line or it goes to a committee. On the other hand, you can be a trustee of a very small charity, but effectively you end up wearing 2 hats, that of being a volunteer and that of being a trustee, and you end up, if you're not confused, it gets a little bit schizophrenic because you're sitting in the boardroom, and in fact I'm a trustee of an Olympic Legacy project, and it's a big cycling charity, and we've got a chap on our board who hasn't quite made the distinction between being strategic, holding the management to account, and being tactical and operational. And so he will come into the board meeting with his volunteer hat on, and we're talking about balancing the books, and he's talking about there's a divot in the tarmac that needs sorting out. And so you've just got to be careful in terms of size and scale. If you join a trustee board, typically you're asked to also sit on a subcommittee. That's the typical expectation. Most charities are now moving to having board meetings at twilight, so 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, rather than during the day, which many in the past typically did when there was a bunch of externals and their wives and things. And I would just add one other thing. I think the charitable sector has professionalised over the last 20 to 30 years in quite an extraordinary way. I think there still is, in some parts of the community, a view that charity is a bunch of people that turn up to work in sandals with, you know, cardigans, and they sit around playing their guitar and it's all really amateur. Actually, that's not the case at all. But like any sector, there are some examples of awful practice and there are some examples of fantastic practice. And governance has sort of lagged behind the curve over the last 20 years, but in the last 5 years we've seen sort of renaissance at the governance level where organisations are paying headhunters, great for us to find them trustees, but actually they're holding themselves to account and they're measuring their performance and assessing their behaviour and appraising the chair. And it's been so encouraging to watch. So a really long rambling answer to a simple question.
No, that's all right. Comprehensive.
But, yeah, comprehensive.
And do you ever get paid as a charity trustee? Should you?
Oh, that's you really taking the pin out of the grenade there. The consensus at this point is that even if you're a trustee of an organisation, take the Red Cross, you know, it turns over £250 million a year, 3,000 staff, something like 200,000 volunteers, the trustees are all unremunerated. And there is an argument that says, well, actually, you're going to get more for your money if you actually pay someone. The counter-argument, and I guess I'm slightly on the counter side, is trustees are the custodians of the voluntary spirit of the sector that we have. And actually, we mess around with that without peril, and we really want people to be trustees for the right reasons. So I don't think it's clear-cut. You can get dispensation from the Charity Commission, and they will authorise it in extremis, but it's very rare. And I just think it's a point that's being discussed at the moment, but I think if we go down that road, we've got to be very careful.
Does it be interesting, what do you think? Do you think charitable trusteeship should remain voluntary, even if they become several days a week? Yes, general vote, hands up, who says yes? Good, so everybody Ian, so that's right, we can use that as a bit of genuine research. Oliver, with the sort of these scale-up companies, whether you're an investing director or you get NED because the VC sort of somehow you end up there, let's assume. What are your sort of roles and responsibilities? You've got your 16 to 24,000 a year. And
yeah.
Well, actually, that's a very good point. Actually, working out what your roles and responsibilities are is something that's you clearly need to establish beforehand. I mean, a number of people become non-execs not really knowing what they're expected to do. But just going back to Mark's point, we get entrepreneurs that come to us and they've got their business card which says founder, chairman, CEO, and president, which actually we're looking to raise external equity. It doesn't bode very well for the corporate governance of the company. So we're very much looking for investing non-execs who can add value. I think from your point of view as non-execs, I think one is to clarify exactly what your role and responsibilities are. Secondly, to make sure there's a good personal fit, and that's probably one of the main things from getting a non-exec. It's actually liking the CEO or the other people, and actually it's good fun. Thirdly, making sure you can add some value, whether it's not just raiding, not expecting to raid your personal address book to raise further funds, but actually where you can open other doors and be of genuine help to the company. So we're looking for investing non-execs. We're looking for one in a healthcare company, one in a financial technology company, one in a recycling company. We're also looking for exciting growth companies looking to raise one that's $500,000 or something like that. That's a short pathway.
What do you think about the issue of sort of checking out the opportunity? I mean, I think people tend to think if I'm invited to do an NED, that's like a badge of honour. So I say yes, and many people have trod that path and discovered to their peril. My particular thing is to check out, funnily enough, your fellow directors, particularly your NEDs, because they can have a big impact on your life. And I probably shouldn't really cite it, but I remember, do you remember when there was that thing, was it last year, when Patricia Hewitt was suddenly accused of being involved in some publication in the 70s that was to do with children or something nasty? And she was on the board of BT, and you can just imagine what the other non-execs on the BT board probably thought they read that, saying, this is nothing to do with us. We probably had no idea, and suddenly we are associated with this problem. So, Anne, tell me with your sort of perspective on what are the key things you need to think about, questions to ask, even if somebody wants you to do it?
It's very interesting. It's interesting, Brennan, to hear you say that, because I had lunch with a retiring partner from a Big Four firm the other day, and he was talking about a mutual friend of ours who has 3 FTSE 100 appointments, and he's a very fine individual, but one of the FTSE 100 businesses, which is in the retail sector, and is very well known to all of us, has taken an absolute battering, which I, with my accounting thought process on, was not necessarily attributable. I could see the factors that arose to the hole in the accounts, but I could also see that this individual, who was head of the audit committee, has been unfairly traduced. So my friend and I, when we were having lunch, he said, I simply wouldn't take a FTSE 100 position. And you think back to a few years ago when Fred Goodwin, who many of us in this room, or those of us who are Scottish in this room know, and I trained around the same time as him, and his board, his non-executive board, who were really probably frightened of him, and they certainly weren't going to challenge him, and yet this was a man who did not fully understand what was going on in his bank, although I know it's more complicated than that. So you look at that big end of the market, and then you look at family-run businesses. Now, how do family-run businesses grow? They grow because they have one mighty, powerful founder, just as Oliver has just said. And that person can be so anxious to have control and unable to relinquish control that the non-executives they bring in have, how do you deal with that as a non-executive? If you stand up to that individual, you may find yourself out in the street. And the other thing you have to think about is, what is your agenda for taking a non-executive role? So are you comfortably enough off that you can be an investor and you're wanting to share in the risk, and you're effectively a director and an equity holder? Or are you needing some income because you've school-age children, and therefore you're keen to hang on to the role because it's giving you a repeat income. You know, or are you somewhere in between? So you have to ask yourself what your agenda is and what the behaviour of the organisation looks like. But Oliver's point about likability is a very important one, because I have seen people blame factors such as their colour or their gender for not getting non-executive roles, where my take would be they're too daunting to work with, and how do you explain that to them?
Ian, do we have a problem in the sort of charitable world where you have some sort of personality problem? Certainly, I've had experience of the problem wasn't the organisation, it was the fellow trustees who started being very, well, I'll say stupid, that's a charitable way of describing what they got up to, but they, you know, I think this issue of sort of where you're exposed as an MED or as a, even in a sort of executive position, when you've got these other people who you're sort of jointly and separately liable. Is that true in the charity world as well?
I mean, I've got a maybe a slightly nuanced view on, if I'm hearing you right, a friend of mine once said that the best boards are comprised of people that can barely tolerate one another's company, held together by a really good chair. And it was hyperbole, but I think the point he was trying to stress was that, and actually in the US they've done some research in the criminal justice system with juries where they put really diverse people together to see if the outcome of their decision-making processes were better. And what they found was that actually the time it took to reach the decision and to build consensus was longer, but the outcome was always better. And they've now rolled that out and tested it in other areas. And so to answer your question, I think personalities in the charity sector play a part on the board for sure. You've got to have a really good chair, but I think you need a mix of people, because I do think diverse boards make better decisions. This is quite controversial given the audience here, but there are lots of boards that are men of a certain age, men of a certain colour, stale pale male, I'll just get it out, that's right. And there's nothing wrong with being pale and male. I think that's absolutely, you know, you're born that way, that's fantastic. But if the entire board is comprised of that way, I think you get groupthink, and there's a real danger there. So to answer your question, I think two things. One, you've got to have a diverse board. I think that's really important. Diverse in every sense, not just gender, socioeconomic. Too many people join boards and they're well educated, and I can understand that, but you need people from all sorts of backgrounds. But the nuance, particularly for the charity sector, is founder syndrome. And you get a lot of people on charity boards who, you know, classic charity, National Autistic Society, was set up around a kitchen table with a group of parents who said provision for our kids is not adequate, so they created a brilliant organisation. The danger is those founders have an executive role, then they step onto the board, and then you can't get rid of them, and they become very, very difficult to work with. And because people in the charitable sector are so passionate about what they do, it's its greatest strength, but it's its greatest weakness as well. And the passion acts as a blocker for change. And so I think actually a charity board is actually very, very difficult to manage because of all those various factors that you have a really good chair.
Thank you very much. We've got to end very soon. I'm being waved at the back. I'd just like to sort of end really with some quite short pithy comments by you all. When do you leave the board? Oliver, when do you leave? When do you leave as investment director?
That's a real toughie. When do you leave a board?
You've got to leave while they still want you.
Leave while they still want you, okay?
You've got to.
Yeah, I mean, it's a real toughie. I don't know, actually.
Ian, when do you leave?
Yeah, I think you actually set term limits on people's tenures. So in the charity sector, for example, it's becoming increasingly common that you serve 2 terms of 3 years and then you're off.
And you don't just get renewed every year?
No, or maybe 3 terms of 3 years, but then you're off. And the reason for that is you've got, you know, often we're our worst enemy. You don't realise when you've kind of gone past your sell-by date. And, you know, the organisation needs repression. So I think you force it on people.
Marcus, is there anything more formal than that in the aim?
No, not more formal. And I think I would probably, ironically, err on the less prescriptive side. You know, I think people can know when it feels right, and when it starts to become the same thing, time and time again. So I think, once it becomes very samey, that whole mix of thoughts and knowledge has probably started to pass.
Yeah.
Well said, my three colleagues. I sit on the board of commercial development arm of a housing association in Scotland, and I'm relatively new on the board. Well, I've been there 2 years now, but a lot of the members there come from the public sector, and they've been there for about 20 years, and they are truly stale. It's a wee excursion for them, and that is not good. You can see it paralysing the work that we can do. It's not, the business needs refreshed, and they're not refreshing. So I'm afraid I have asked the Chief Executive to consider the construction of this.
And I think my contribution would be that I think you start getting a bit complacent, start thinking everyone else is less clever than you. That probably means that you're getting it wrong, and you should start. Anyway, any quick questions from the audience? Yes, Kat.
Just interested in a brief comment with many of you about risk and liability, and the thoughts you've got on something like professional indemnity, needed, absolutely required, not necessary. Any thoughts?
D&O insurance and things like that, or is making sure there's adequate protection in that respect, making sure you don't become shadow director. You do have to look out for things, you have to recognise your obligations. Obviously, most people know that already, but those are two things I would look out for.
I would say, as far as charities go, do not join the board of an unincorporated organisation. That you really are not hiding to nothing. If you're with an incorporated organisation, the liability rests with the organisation rather than yourself under company law. Although, of course, if you're fraudulent and you do things, you're in trouble. But the Charities Commission takes a fairly, and the courts take a very sensitive approach to the fact that you're a volunteer, so long as you've sought the right advice, you've done your minutes properly, you can record everything, it should be okay. Shouldn't put you off.
Executive directors being on boards as non-executive directors without necessarily having any training or preparation for that, with our operational focus, non-executive directors that maybe can't function that well as a non-executive director. What views?
So I missed that actually.
Sorry, so it's the role.
You're saying one is ill prepared for a non-executive role.
Exactly, moving into non-executive.
One of the people here actually address that, because you run consultancies and businesses that help prepare people for non-executive roles. I'm not too sure what the preparation is for that, but I think we need to be quite well briefed, so I'm not a good person to answer that question.
Well, we've seen it where you had ex-CEOs or executives moving into a non-exec role once they get, they sort of semi-retiring, and they find it very difficult being in the passenger seat when they were in the driving seat. And then they try and drive, and then that's when you get a bit of a car crash.
Right, well, thank you very much. Brilliant contributions. Thank you.